Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to our second edition of Breaking News for this Wednesday, the 8th day of May, 2024, as we have some more stories that have come across the wire in the last 7 hours since we talked to you last that are very, very important. In fact, extremely interesting, both of them. The first has to do with Israel having taken over the Gazan side of the Rafah crossing, as well as a recent poll that shows these campus protests against Israel are miserably failing. People do not like what they're seeing, and this is not surprising. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, headline number one. Now, this is interesting because it contains a lot of different facets. First of all, the U.S. signals backing for a limited operation after the IDF takes over the Gazan side of the Rafah crossing. We're going to see is basically in our next story that Biden actually approved this, and there's a reason why, as we will see. So the State Department now has said it's legitimate for Israel to prevent Hamas from collecting revenue at the border gate with Egypt, while urging quick reopening of the crossing so aid deliveries can continue. The Biden administration appeared to signal its initial approval of the operation launched by Israel early Tuesday morning to take over the Palestinian side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Spokespeople for the administration said the goals of the operation were legitimate, but warned that this assessment could change if the offensive expands in scope and leads to an extended hampering of aid shipments into Gaza. What we've been told by our Israeli counterparts is that this operation last night was limited and designed to cut off from Hamas's ability to smuggle weapons and funds into Gaza. That's White House National Security spokesman John Kirby telling reporters in a briefing. Now, in a separate briefing, a spokesperson named Matthew Miller says this does appear to be a limited operation so far, but it does to a great extent depend on what comes next. U.S. officials sought to distinguish between the actions Israel has so far taken and a potential more significant military operation, which hasn't happened yet, which they continue to oppose due to fears that the million-plus Palestinians sheltering in Rafah would be put at risk. We have made clear that we don't want to see a major military operation. This does look like a prelude to a major military operation. In terms of policy response, we'll see what happens next before we make this determination. And then they said this, one of the things that Israel has said, which is very much accurate, is that Hamas still controlled the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing, and Hamas was collecting revenue from this crossing being open, the State Department spokesman said. So it is a legitimate goal to try and deprive Hamas of money that they could use to continue to finance their terrorist activities. And as the story continues, as we've been mentioning for months, Netanyahu has declared that Israel troops would carry out an operation to root out the final Hamas strongholds in Rafah, regardless of whether an agreement was reached in an ongoing hostage talks. According to the IDF, the Israeli defense officials, four of Hamas's six remaining battalions are in the city, along with members of the terror group's leadership and a significant number of hostages they abducted from Israel on October 7th, which basically sparked the war. All right, so the initial response by the State Department and the Biden administration is that this was something good that they did. Now we got a follow up with this. This is from Joe Rosenberg's All Israel News. It says the White House says Rafah operation is limited. Israel says Rafah operation will expand as necessary. So the whole article is about as after Israel captured the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt on Tuesday morning, conflicting accounts emerged from Israel and the U.S. regarding the objectives of the operation. Well, not really. The objectives of the operation are clear right now. Israel has deprived Hamas of bringing weapons over from Egypt, bringing monies over from Egypt, bringing any types of explosives over from Egypt. In other words, this is something that is extremely important for them to do because the people at the Rafah border station on the Egyptian side and the Palestinian side, when these foodstuffs and things came from Egypt and they smuggled weapons and other things, they were all Hamas operatives. They weren't any kind of neutral observers. Now that's not going to be the case. So food that is meant to come to the citizens of Gaza, the poor, million plus people that are there, will come across and will be directed and distributed to these people, not by Hamas, which took the lion's share of the food to supply its own soldiers. That's done. That's gone. So this was a huge, huge operation that took place there. And the U.S. and Egypt, of course, were in agreement with this. as well as Israel. Now, there's an interesting story here next. Now, this is fascinating. I only got this from Zero Hedge. It's the only place I've seen it. A private U.S. firm with Special Forces veterans to take control of the Rafah border crossing. Despite the Biden administration repeated warning, Israeli leadership in public, they're warning against Israeli leadership in public against a full-scale Rafah invasion. President Biden actually green-lighted the IDF's takeover of the Rafah border crossing. This is from Axios. They revealed this. The report comes amid questions over whether Netanyahu has crossed Biden's red line on Rafah. In other words, this was the question, because right after, remember, that fake agreement that Hamas said, well, we've agreed now to a ceasefire, and all the Gazan citizens started exploding and being happy and shouting and screaming because they thought the war was over. But there was no agreement whatsoever. Hamas had this absolutely horrific so-called ceasefire that only benefited them, didn't benefit Israel, and basically kept them in power. And again, it's a non-starter. And so immediately what happens, Israel goes into Rafah and takes over this station here, the border station, the Rafah crossing, which is the crossing with Egypt. Now, what's fascinating about this, basically, they did not cross the line here because, speaking of the Biden-Netanyahu phone call, Biden didn't put the handbrake on the capture of the Rafah crossing during the call. So far, the IDF is focused on airstrikes and limited ground incursions in the city's east after dropping thousands of leaflets telling civilians to exit the area. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. An Israeli Haaretz report, that's one of their periodicals, Tuesday has further revealed that there was actually some level of cooperation and coordination with Washington on an IDF tank unit's takeover of the Rafah crossing. This was reportedly to ensure no weapons for Hamas can pass into the strip via this large crossing. The U.S., Israel, and Egypt have agreed that a private American security firm will take control of the Rafah crossing and oversee it. As of Wednesday, the IDF has announced it reopened the crossing and it is retaining full control for now. The parties agreed that a private American security company will assume management of the crossing after the IDF concludes its operation. Israel has also pledged not to damage the crossing's facilities to ensure its continuous operation. This is also to exert leverage in negotiations. Israel believes that Hamas's loss of control over the Rafah crossing would be a significant setback for the group, and that's an understatement. Haaretz noted, it will not be able to collect taxes imposed on trucks and goods, and will no longer be able to bring in weapons and other items banned from entering Gaza. Haaretz revealed limited details of the U.S. defense firm in question and has not named it. It employs elite former U.S. military personnel, such as ex-special forces operators. As part of Israel's efforts to win agreement for a Rafah operation, negotiations have been underway with a private company in the U.S. that specializes in assisting armies and governments around the world engaged in military conflicts. The company has operated in several African and Middle Eastern countries, guarding strategic sites like oil fields, airports, army bases, and sensitive border crossing. It employs veterans of the elite U.S. Army units. Under the understandings between the three countries, when Israel has completed its limited operation in the border crossing area, this U.S. company will take responsibility for operating the facility. That includes monitoring goods arriving in the Gaza Strip from Egypt and preventing Hamas from reestablishing control of the crossing. According to the agreement, Israel and the U.S. will assist the company as necessary. This is a win for Israel, the U.S., and Egypt. Wow, what a story. Now, here's what's fascinating. I have a contact who works with the Special Forces. So I talked to this contact, and there's not a whole lot I'm able to say here. I got a lot of really interesting info. But yeah, this is what they do. They're contracted by various governments around the world. They're an organization. They're basically made up of special forces, ex-military special forces, and they work just for peacekeeping wherever they go. They guard oil fields, like it said, they guard airports, army bases, whatever. And they have been hired to basically take care of this Rafah crossing, to make sure that no weapons come in, the goods that come in are meant for the people of Gaza, that it gets to the humanitarian aid, and that there's no attempt to stop this from happening. So basically, they're not an offensive group. They have really strict rules of engagement. or they only return fire if they're fired upon. They're not going out looking for Hamas like the Israelis are doing, but they're there in harm's way as sort of as sitting ducks as they help out with the humanitarian uh, materials that are coming in. And so what they'll be able to do is make sure, and this is tremendous, that these citizens of Gaza get the humanitarian aid that they need during the time Israel conducts the operation against the Hamas terrorists. So this is huge because now Hamas cannot take money from these trucks coming in, cannot take weapons there that are smuggled across, cannot take whatever else is on these trucks. So it's a huge win-win for Egypt, U.S., and Israel because it puts Hamas in a very unfortunate position there where they can't control. Because one of the things we've been talking about, remember that when the foodstuffs come across, Hamas is controlling all of that. Who does it go to? It goes to their soldiers. The poor citizens of Gaza hardly get anything because they're feeding their own army, and now that's not going to be the case any longer. So this is huge. So pray for these people. They're former again they're special forces, ex-military. There's a number of Christians in the group, by the way, too, and there's a lot of evangelism going on, as I understand. So pray for that. They are in harm's way. It is a very difficult situation because they're just there to guard, to protect, these shipments that come in to make sure Hamas doesn't take over the station there, and they will be in control of it. And so this is something that we'll keep our eye upon in the future. So I had a real interesting talk there with my friend about this whole situation. So that's the latest there. And again, like we said, it's a win for Israel, the U.S., and Egypt. All right, one last story here. The Poles, the Hitler Youth Camps, that's what they're called by their Breitbart, these Hamas protests, they backfired by double digits. This is from Rasmussen reports that the anti-Semitic protests at left-wing universities have backfired with the public by double digits. The latest Rasmussen reports national telephone and online surveys find that just 15% of likely U.S. voters say the college protests made them more sympathetic to the Palestinians, while 42% say the protests have made them less sympathetic, writes the pollster. 37% say the protests have not made much difference in how they view the Palestinians. So all across left-wing colleges since April, pro-Hamas Jew haters have staged violent protests in support of the genocidal Islamic terrorist and against Israel, which is guilty of nothing more than wanting to be left alone. These spoiled, entitled, hate-filled bigots staged sit-ins, vandalized buildings, reportedly held working people against their will, and in the spirit of the late Alabama Governor George Wallace, also a Democrat, blocked Jews from entering public spaces. Anyone with any sense of history looks at these campus protests and is reminded of the segregated South when Democrats set up a violent and oppressive Jim Crow system, or is reminded of the pogroms throughout Russia and Europe, or is reminded of Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass in 1938, when Hitler's brown shirts felt emboldened enough to come right up and launch systematic attacks on German Jews. Thankfully, despite the corporate media's pro-Hamas spin, including Vichy's Jake Tapper, the Vichy government, remember that was the government in France that was pro-German during the war, and so he called Jake Tapper from CNN, Vichy spokesman, revealing very fine people on both sides. That's what Tapper said on these protests. The public is disgusted with them. Rasmussen said that out of 1,108 likely voters asked the question, have the college protests made you more sympathetic or less sympathetic of the Palestinians? Only 15% said more sympathetic, while 42% said less sympathetic. That's a 27-point loss for the Americans' Hitler Youth. That's what they call these people, the Hitler Youth. When asked, do you sympathize more with the Israelis or Palestinians? Despite all the corporate propaganda, only 19% chose the Palestinians, while a majority, 53%, sided with the Israelis. And as the article concludes, these numbers should be 100% to 0 in favor of Israel. There is no gray area here. The barbaric savages and Hamas butchered, raped, tortured, and mutilated more than 1,000 innocent Israeli citizens, including children, and took hundreds of more hostages. Hamas is openly dedicated to the annihilation of Israel and the extermination of the Jewish race. Hamas hides behind and seeks casualties among its own citizens. Therefore, Hamas must be exterminated while doing more than any country in history to avoid civilian casualties. Israel is 100% correct in looking to achieve exactly that. And they took a great step forward in taking over this Rafah crossing, because now they can make sure that humanitarian aid does get in and goes to the people that deserve it. So we got two really huge stories today. It's the protests are not resounding with the people of America thinking, yeah, we're on the side of the Palestinians now. No, not at all. They realize Israel has a right to exist, a right to fight back. And like we said this morning in our earlier breaking news episode, whenever you fight a war, there are innocents who are killed accidentally. This always happens. The U.S. has been guilty of that many, many times. So it's not right for them to point the finger at Israel. Anyway, that's the latest. Tomorrow morning we'll have some more stories. There are already a bunch of stories breaking that we'll get to. So, stay tuned. Who knows what's going to happen? I'm Don Stewart. Thanks for watching. Until then, may the Lord, as always, richly, richly bless.